Welcome back, fourth graders. Today's lesson is Chapter 5, Lesson 2 on Slavery Splits the Nation. A short recap in the last chapter, we learned about the fugitive slave law, in which they made it very, very difficult to help escaped slaves escape to Canada. If you were found helping a slave escape to freedom, you could be jailed or face big fines. We also learned about the Underground Railroad, which wasn't a railroad at all, but a grouping of homes, barns, shacks that you could go to be safe in order to progress towards Canada. Remember the Crosswhite family, the escaped family that was very, very scared for their freedom, and they did need to go back to Canada or escape to Canada. And then also, we learned about two very powerful women, Sojourner Truth, who was an escaped slave, who spoke out about being a slave and being treated poorly. We also learned about Laura Haviland, who was the educator who taught African American students but didn't feel that that was enough. So she ended up becoming a person who helped slaves escape towards freedom. So let's go ahead and begin our lesson. Let's turn the page. Chapter 5, Lesson 2, Slavery Splits the Nation. At the very top, we see this soon a war started between the northern states and the southern states. Yet another war. It seems like our country is going into war after war after war. This war was called the Civil War, and let's begin to find out about it. Not everyone in Michigan was against slavery. Not everyone liked to see people out against it. This was an issue which divided some towns. There were people who felt since the national law allowed slavery, that must mean it was okay. Wasn't helping an escaped slave like helping a robber get away from the sheriff? In Battle Creek, a man named Erastus Hussey began a newspaper. His newspaper had articles against slavery. There were some people who could not read it or would not read it. Others made fun of those who did. They might say, "You ain't one of those anti-slavers, are you?" One night, someone set his newspaper office on fire, and it burned down. During 1850s, the anger over slavery increased. Each side became violent. New states were starting in the West. Some of these wanted to have slavery. The government in Washington passed laws to allow it. People in the North became upset with their political parties. So imagine it, boys and girls. Some states wanted slavery, and other states were absolutely against it. And then it went into the towns. Some towns wanted it, and other towns were against it. We have a very important word called political party. We have two political parties that are the strong ones in our country, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, as we will be learning very soon as we take a pause in our Michigan history and turn to government. But let's begin reading. The new political party, the Republicans. There wasn't much talk about starting a new political party. Why couldn't there be a party against slavery? Meetings were held to plan that party. About 1,500 people met in Jackson, Michigan. They decided to form a new party against slavery. They named it the Republican Party. The year was 1854. Let's turn the page. Soon people from many states joined the Republican Party. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran for president of the United States as a Republican and won. Abraham Lincoln's victory really bothered many southern states. In some of those states, he was not even on the ballot, meaning that piece of paper that people could check the box of the person they wanted for president. It seemed no one wanted to try to work together anymore. You were either completely for slavery or completely against it. We are going to leave. Several states decided to leave the United States because they wanted to keep slavery. These states were in the South. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Could states decide to leave the country? They thought they could. This means war. In 1861, soldiers from the South attacked the fort belonging to the national government. The war had begun. This war was called the Civil War. It got its name because it was a war between parts of the same country. The United States was ripped into two parts. In this war, the North was called the Union side because they wanted the country united again. The South was called the Confederate States of America. A confederacy is a kind of group. Michigan was part of the Union side. No battles were ever fought in Michigan, but we did have some famous people in the war. We see in the bottom corner a young boy who was in the Civil War. He was a drummer. Too young to serve as a soldier, he did his part to support the war and end slavery. Let's turn the page. The soldier in the picture is General George Custer, and he grew up in Michigan. He commanded a Michigan cavalry unit during the Civil War. Cavalry means those men were on horseback. Let's begin. Custer becomes a general. George Custer was a young man from Monroe, Michigan. He left to study at West Point Academy and had just graduated when the war began. He was in the first battle. He was a daring soldier. It was not long before he became captain in the cavalry. As he rode, he often shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Because he was a brave leader, he was finally made a general. He was one of the youngest ever. Later, Custer became really famous because of what happened to him after the war. Years later, he led troops against the tribes in the West. He seemed to think he knew everything, and he was not very careful. One day, in 1876, he ordered his soldiers to attack a huge group of Native American warriors in Montana. As a result, George Custer and all his men were killed. This is a very famous battle called the Battle of Little Bighorn. At the bottom of the page, let's find out how women helped during the Civil War. Often women at home gathered newspapers and blankets to send to the soldiers. Others sent food. Several Michigan women were nurses during the war. Some of these ladies were Elmira Brainerd, Bridget Devens, Annie Etheridge, Jenny Hayes, and Julia Wheelock. The nurses often worked under terrible, terrible conditions, and sometimes it was dangerous as well. Let's turn the page. At the top of this page, we see a woman tending to a man who was hurt or injured in the Civil War. This woman, they say, is Annie Etheridge, and she was about 21 years old when the war began. She volunteered to be a nurse. Nurses had to be brave to do their work. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, Anna was bandaging the wounds of a soldier. He had just whispered his thanks to her. Suddenly, he was hit and killed by a cannonball. Once, she stopped to talk to a little drummer boy when he was shot. The boy fell against her and dropped dead to the ground. She was held in the highest regard by Union soldiers. They often called her Gentle Annie. Besides wounds from the battle, the Civil War nurses and doctors had to face great deals of disease. For every 4 Michigan soldiers who died from wounds, 10 died from disease. One astonished soldier said, "This is about his group." Quote, "We have lost about 30 by disease and have not lost one by a bullet." So it was very, very dangerous, but very full of disease that were killing more men than the bullets. Let's turn the page. Everyone works to win. We see at the corner of the page an African American from Michigan who fought in the Civil War. So men, women, and even young boys helped to fight in the war. Let's begin. The people of Michigan did not did more than send soldiers to fight. They mined more copper for brass buttons and other items. They mined more iron to make rifles and cannons. Michigan farmers raised more sheep for their wool. They raised more wheat to feed the soldiers. Everyone had to work harder to do this. There were fewer people to do the work. Many of the men were always fighting. Women had to run farms while their husbands were away. The Civil War was very bloody. During the war, more than 90,000 Michigan men went to fight. About 4,100 were killed, and about 10,000 others died of disease. We see a picture in the middle of the page of a reenactment, which means a do-over. This didn't really happen at the time. They kind of staged it, dressed up in the uniforms to show you what it would look like. It is over, wild with joy. One day, the war ended. The Union side won. All the states were again part of the United States. There was no more slavery. This is what one Michigan soldier said, quote, "Everyone is wild with joy. As for myself, I cannot write. I cannot talk. Only my glad heart cries." Now, boys and girls, it wasn't over in a day or a week, but it actually took 4 years of fighting with many, many men dying of bullet wounds and diseases. The Union thought that no one person should own another person and ended up making slavery illegal. It took many lives and a long, long time. So when you get into middle school and high school, you will actually study more about the Civil War. Let's turn the page. At the top of the page, we see Civil War soldiers from Michigan. These are actual Civil War soldiers. You can see their uniforms and their very long rifles with a metal piece on the end called a bayonet. So if they couldn't shoot the person, they would stab the person. We see that there's boots and brass buttons from Michigan, and also looks like someone else is trying to help that person get dressed or maybe tie their shoes. So then the soldiers came home. The war is over. They tried to forget the battle and the horrible things they saw. They tried to look to the future. They went back to work on their farms, in their stores, offices, and factories. There was much to do in Michigan because our state was growing. There were homes and factories to build. There were new industries where people could work. At the bottom, you see some of your questions that you will see in your exit ticket. Why did people start the Republican Party? Who was General George Custer? And who are some of the other important people from Michigan that fought in the Civil War? Please make sure that you reread the story or maybe go page by page to find the answers. All of those things are really good strategies in order to help you be successful on your exit ticket. That's it for today.